There we go. Oh goodness. I got actually a really good night to sleep, and I was tempted to say because of that, I don't know why I'm so tired, but that's sort of my short-term memory getting to me. I know exactly why I'm tired. It's because it's gray and cloudy and kind of rainy today, and that tends to have that sort of effect on me. Even if like most circumstances have aligned pretty well otherwise, I still just yeah, days like this just kind of feel like shit for me. Waking up feels like I got memory damage. It would be nice. I'm trying to by setting an alarm for 7:30 in the morning every morning, with the exception of weekends, I'm trying to build a habit over time of waking up at or around 7:30, so that my internal clock will just sort of do that on its own, you know? Feels weird not to not know what happened in the last like 10 minutes. Yeah, sometimes when I wake up, it's like the events are like pretty foggy. Or did you just mean like in general? In which case that's really not a good feeling. I think I was gonna say I don't that doesn't happen as much to me, but I think that's happened a couple times. In general, when you wake up? Yeah, okay. I think that's like actually a thing that that's like more normal. But yes, it's also not a good feeling. It's like there's just kind of this blur when you wake up in your memory where it's like kind of hard to tell uh uh when you woke up and when you were like actually conscious because you can't like fully remember shit in sequence. Oh my god. I'm yawning a lot. Hmm. I think it could also be the case that um when it's winter, when it's the fall and winter months, the air gets a lot thinner. And that means that I get out of breath more easily. So I'll have to yawn more 'cause I need that oxygen. I need that air. And apparently yawning is yawning happens when there's not enough airflow in your body. It's not like just when you're tired. You can yawn when you're like not tired if your breathing rhythm isn't getting quite enough air into your system, because yawning gets a lot of air in and then a lot of air out. And then hiccups can be the opposite. Like the meme is that people get hiccups when they're drunk, or they get hiccups when like something goes down the wrong way. You ate something or whatever. Um, but I've had hiccups. It's been a long time. I've had hiccups just off rip, just randomly, no food or drink involved. And I think the reason for that, if I remember what I read correctly, is that hiccups are caused by the opposite thing. When you have too much air flowing like too quickly or something. So if you're hyperventilating, if you've like just been running or whatever, it could cause you to yawn later when you're tired. But like in the moment, if you get really worked up, you start breathing really hard, you can actually give yourself the hiccups. That's also why sometimes you get the hiccups when you're really surprised, when you get jumped by something, like you get startled, because it'll be like, that's kind of the reaction that you'll have, and all that air coming in all at once, it'll be like, and you'll get the hiccups. Yeah, it's been known to happen. It does though. It feels really good to understand that. And I gotta say, having experienced both of those things, just yawning off rip and having hiccups off rip, yawning off rip just feels way better. uh, Notice that my fingers are breaking? You mean like the skin? Like your skin cracking? You gotta use lotion or moisturizer or something for that. That used to happen to me in college. I used to really not take good care of myself. I attribute part of this to depression, although looking back on it with some context that will become relevant later in the stream because there's a subject that's kind of related that I'm going to be talking about. I could also attribute it to a general pattern of dysfunction that probably a lot of people experience, especially now. But when the fall and winter months came, yeah, same thing with me. The skin, particularly like on and between my knuckles, here, would start to crack and break, and I would bleed. And because I was depressed at the time and like severely lacking in motivation, I mean, I'm still depressed. I take medication now, and I'm trying to work on the things that cause me to have depressive experiences and to feel that lack of motivation. When I wasn't medicated and did not understand living with depression as well, but was also still depressed in college, I just kind of wouldn't care. Like my skin would crack and start bleeding, and I would just let it do that. Occasionally if it got bad enough, I'd put a bandage on it. But basically between October and April, I would have very dry, often like cracked skin. It'll probably take a couple months to heal. Buddy, it's going to take until the spring months to heal. The reason that your skin cracks and breaks like that in the wintertime, and it doesn't in the summertime and the springtime, is because in spring and summer, there's a lot more moisture in the air, and your skin actually absorbs some of that. Particularly the skin on your hands. That's where it's most notable because the skin around your knuckles is very vulnerable to that. Yeah, use some moisturizer. I moisturize my hands every day, twice a day. When I get up after I take a shower, I moisturize my hands. And then when I'm getting ready for bed, like when I brush my teeth and all that, I moisturize my hands again 2 times a day so that I don't have to experience that problem again. And since I started doing this, I actually have never had the sort of problem with cracking and breaking skin. It's a pretty crucial part of taking care of yourself. And I realize in retrospect as well, that was self-harm. Like I knew exactly what I could do to stop it because people around me told me, moisturizer, nothing. You could use moisturizer for that. It's not that expensive. And I let my skin crack and break and bleed anyway. It's not like it was painless either. It stung a lot, you know? Especially when I would frequently I have to apply hand sanitizer, wash my hands and whatever, so that I at least didn't get infected. But I would just sort of let it hurt because I didn't care about getting hurt in that way. It's just a thing I forget about until the next year. Um, if I were you, I'd try to start addressing that just at your convenience. It's a pretty moisturizing your hands is a pretty easy thing to like incorporate into your day. You just kind of do it at the start of the day and lather your hands up like you've got soap or whatever, and then that's it. Usually, the directions will recommend like, yeah, do this once or twice a day. Once you get to muscle memories, ain't no thing. Um, yeah. But don't do what I did. Definitely don't let that go unchecked because it is going to sting. It's gonna, uh, you know, it's just not gonna be fun to have skin that cracks and breaks every winter. I moisturize my face too. I've had like dry skin problems around, particularly like around here, around my nose and mouth. I've had like dry skin, so I moisturize my face as well. Definitely, I will say this. I paid a lot more attention to that because it hurt a lot worse when I would get skin cracking and bleeding around like my mouth. Like that has happened to me before and that was really bad. Haven't let it happen to an extent where it's bad. It happening at all is not good, you know? Either way, it's still like a health risk. You know, like if you get a cut, consider it kind of like the same thing as getting a cut. If you get a cut, you don't want that to get infected, right? So what do? You dress it, you wash your hands with soap, and you put a band-aid over it, right? And that's what I used to do sometimes with that. But like, even just for your own health, it's not good for you to let your skin crack and break like that. But I realized trying to convince you of this further isn't going to do anything. It sure as shit didn't do anything for me when I was in college and letting that shit happen to myself. So I don't know. Just do what you got to do. I just have memory damage. That's all. That's fair. I can tell I've seen your brain work for the process. Yeah. Okay. I don't really have a link for this thing that I might want to touch on first because this is a little bit lighter. Apparently, MAGA world is like in pieces, which I was aware of to a certain extent. Like, I think everybody kind of knew from the moment the Epstein files dropped, like were released, which I don't think they've been released yet. They're still under review by the DOJ, uh, uh, and are going to be released sometime soon. I think the DOJ, I don't remember when the DOJ got them, but the DOJ has like 30 days to make whatever redactions they deem appropriate, and then they have to be released to the public. Imagine if they're delaying as much as possible. They probably are. But nonetheless, since that happened, MAGA has kind of died. Myself and a lot of other leftists, left-leaning content creators and just people generally have sort of diagnosed and predicted that this is the death of the MAGA movement, basically, because so much of the MAGA movement, modern neoliberalism, modern fascism, is based off of aura farming, right? And the MAGA movement was like aura farming off of Trump. How do you aura farm off of Trump when he's like the most implicated pedophile of all time with John pedophilia, Jeffrey Epstein, you know? I wonder which will die first, MAGA or Trump? Trump will die first. MAGA is like a flailing corpse right now, but there's still people who like wear the red hat and shit. No, I guess maybe I'll go to Twitter for a bit and see if I can't find an example of what I'm talking about. Here, hold on. Or just take to the internet generally. Where is I can't seem to find a good link necessarily for what I'm talking about. I guess here, let's see. The Guardian here is saying, oh yeah, they're infighting over Jeffrey Epstein and anti-Semitism and other things. Cracks have emerged in such and such. Here, hold on. Where do they say this? Okay, great. That's the title, but signals of his waning influence are everywhere. The sharks can smell blood in the water. After a decade in eerie command of the Republican Party with primary voters in his cult-like thrall and down ballot... This is just boilerplate populism. I hate to say it. Like, yes, it is very cultish because it is a cult of personality. But people have to realize that this kind of parasociality is necessary for a functional politics. And the unhealthy thing is that Trump was seemingly the only personality for people to latch onto, which is why the attachment, the parasocial attachment to Trump is so much more severe in this instance. Genuinely, if Trump were not the only populist running around, if there were others, if the Democrats permitted their own populists to enjoy the spoils, resources, and support of the party, people would not be as cultishly adhesive to Trump. Does that make sense? Liberals probably think populism is mental illness. I mean, most likely. They don't view it as like I mean, because of the end of history, West Wing kind of bedrock of understanding politics that liberals generally operate off of, I think there's genuinely a mental block that they have from viewing populism as a political phenomenon that is predictable, occurs under certain circumstances, and has to be factored into the way that a party grows, changes, and behaves in politics, right? But I genuinely don't think they think about it that way, because they view it as like there is no more politics to do. Politics is over. And like they don't have any sort of platform or program for the country that they believe in hard enough to view it as necessary to make those adaptations. Down ballot elected officials and voters alike feeling they have no choice and often no inclination to diverge from him. I don't mean when the idea, I mean when they see it. No, yeah, I know. I think liberals, like, when they see it, are just completely confounded by it. They just don't know. It's like they see populism in front of them. Like, and they're just deer in the headlights. They probably have some theoretical explanation for populism, as far from correct as it may be, you know, but when confronted with it actually happening, it is actually unthinkable for them. So, yeah. Donald Trump suddenly seems not quite in control of his own political machine. Fractures have emerged in the MAGA coalition. Trump's approval is sinking. The Democrats, long anemic and risk-averse in the opposition, thank you for being one of the only news outlets that will actually say as much, showed signs of life in elections last month. And the cumulative effect of a long series of long-running scandals, most particularly the Epstein affair, seem to have alienated core components of the Trump faithful. Trump has faced some rebukes from a once largely compliant federal judiciary. His personal attorney, Alina Habba, was recently declared ineligible to serve in the U.S. attorney role Trump appointed her to. Wait, really? That's funny as fuck. The courts literally said, no, she cannot be a U.S. attorney. I didn't even know about that. El Bozo. And his signature tariffs seem likely to be struck down by a conservative Supreme Court majority. Trump himself, meanwhile, is unfocused, losing his signature humor and charisma and showing his age. In recent photos, he looks pale, exhausted. He seems to have struggled to keep his eyes open in front of the cameras. I think Kyle Kulinski of Secular Talk has pointed this out several times, that visibly, like, Trump is visibly deteriorating. And, you know, the more you see him in footage, the more you can piece that together, where he seems increasingly unable to flow the way that he used to in a charismatic sort of way. He seems more old and belligerent than charismatic and bullish, if that makes sense. You know? Trump seems more interested in the construction of his oversized ballroom than the work of policy. His advisors, the scheming group of frauds, racists, opportunists, and swindlers who surround him in his second term. Thank you, Guardian. Again, very cool. are evidently running the show, and they do not always see eye to eye. The old man won't be around forever. Republicans are beginning to imagine what the country, and more importantly, their own careers, will look like without him. He's probably getting angry from the body pain. Possibly. He's also like, you gotta, we gotta remember too that Trump does want control over like the country in a way. He's very reality TV brained, very management brained. So he wants control over like the people around him, the people in his social circle. And he used to be able to command a sort of presence with his charisma and ability to like roll with the punches and just say some out of pocket shit that sounds confident enough for him to be funny. But he can't do that anymore. And there's sort of a compounding effect where he gets less and less lucid, which causes him to become angrier and angrier because that lack of lucidity translates into a lack of control over people around him. Right? It is some Mad King type shit. But again, you won't hear any of this analysis from liberal institutional media, except for, I guess, The Guardian, because for especially American news outlets, personality is non-existent in politics, and everything must be subsumed under the artifice of the institution. So their explanations for why Trump does what he does are always uncharacteristically institutional and ideological. You know, Republicans are beginning to imagine what the country and more importantly, their own careers will look like without him. It's probably a bunch of things. Yeah, Trump is very human, which means he's also very complicated. So there's a lot going on in his head, even if he's not that bright, and there's a lot going on around him too. Is this how the Trump era in American politics ends? Not with a bang, but with a whimper. It would be overstating the case and speaking far too soon to say that Trump has become a lame duck. No, I actually don't think that would be overstating the case. I think Trump is kind of a lame duck. I don't think he recently pitched a healthcare subsidy thing to Congress, and it fell flat on its face, even with the Republicans controlling both houses of Congress. Like he wanted to do some neo-lib $1,000 per month HSA subsidy, like health savings account subsidy that wouldn't benefit like basically anybody. And he passed that over to the House of Representatives, and they instantly just didn't go for it. They were like, yeah, no, you're waffling, sir. I think it wouldn't be overstating the case or speaking too soon to call Trump a lame duck in the first year of his presidency. Or that the Republican Party is moving on from the identity that he gave it. That I think is also true. They haven't moved on from that completely yet. It's only a matter of time though. Yeah, the signals of his waning influence are everywhere. I forget how sticky lotion is every year. Yeah, it depending on the lotion, you're supposed to use like more or less of it when you're like moisturizing your hands and stuff. Use as directed type shit. You'd be amazed how much your life improves if you just read the labels of shit. And you'd be amazed how many full-grown adults do not read the labels or instructions. For one thing, more and more Republicans seem willing to break with Trump, something that would have been unthinkable for them and a kind of career suicide just a few months ago. While Trump was able to compel Republicans in the Texas state legislature to draw new congressional district maps with just a command, an effort that's now facing an uphill battle in the courts. Oh, I didn't mean to click that link. Republicans in Indiana are resisting Trump's push to have them do the same, with one GOP legislator saying that she, quote, will not cave on redistricting, even as she announced a pipe bomb threat had been called into her house. Interesting. in a way, it does make sense that Trump's influence is deteriorating at the state level first, because state politicians and state politics have always had more of an identity than federal politics. You know, like where a lot of Republicans at the federal level, most of the Republicans at the federal level, are just wannabe social media grifters. A lot of Republicans at the state level will authentically be fascists and like big government neoconservatives or something, you know? Like there is an actual underlying ideology motivating people in state politics because of them being a little bit more removed from the nerve centers of capital in this country, which permits them more room to maneuver politically from person to person, right? Where they're not as compromised at the state level by business interests. Still very compromised by business interests, but not as much. So you see that reflected in their ideologies. You'll get much more open advocacy for, social democratic policy, and you will also get much more visceral fascism, virulent fascism, like fascism that's willing to do things that are bad for business. Yeah, it's the corruption capital kind of factor. DC being the federal seat of power for the wealthiest country in the history of the world has a lot of influence, or rather means that capital will have a lot of influence, particularly in the American federal government, because of how much power the American federal government has and how much power the American state has. Corporations want that power. Any individual state in the United States still has a lot of power. And certainly the more power they have economically, the more corporations care about influencing that state. See, for instance, California, Texas, New York, Florida, very large, very economically active and wealthy states. But even in those states, it's a bit less. It's noticeably less than in federal government. All that to say, this analysis tracks that like Republicans in Congress are still careerists, but at the state level, you're starting to see more and more people break away. Other signs are beginning to stir. Trump, with his typically casual relationship to the truth, has insisted that the economy is booming as a result of his ill-conceived tariff program. Costs are way down, he said falsely in a long 10th of November interview with Fox's Laura Ingraham. The absolute state of American journalism is that this is good journalism by comparison, right? The Guardian isn't even that great, right? But if this were an American media outlet, they would not have even specified that Trump said something false. They would have just aired his claims uncritically. How do I know this? Because Politico did an interview with Donald Trump where they proceeded to let him lie completely unimpeded during the interview and also did not do any fact-checking during or after the fact. American news outlets will literally, we even looked at a Reuters article on this stream when I was talking about the tariffs when they were first announced. American news outlets will literally edit their own coverage to make Trump look better and to avoid ever accusing him of even saying something remotely false, because Trump is a capitalist. He runs in capitalist social circles. He's wealthy. He owns like businesses and shares and whatever in real estate. And he's friends with a lot of other capitalists, wealthy business owners. Those same wealthy business owners owned the news. They control what gets printed. The people who control what gets printed in Reuters, in Politico, in the New York Times, in the Washington Post are all friends with Donald Trump. Personally, the owners of those news outlets know Donald Trump personally, and they want to get on his good side, particularly because News is still run like a private business. Trump being the president, he has the power to make life better or worse for that business. So they're going to give him glowing gluck, gluck, gluck coverage. But The Guardian, being a little bit more removed from that, can afford to say something as inoffensively and obviously correct as Trump falsely claimed that costs have decreased. I fucking hate journalism. Ingram pushed back, rare for a Fox host, and soon other right-wing mouthpieces were too. It's so fucked up that the right-wing mouthpieces are the first ones pushing back, and then the quote-unquote left-wing, in parentheses liberal, news media at CNN, NBC, Politico, Reuters, etc., are engaging in sane washing, like constantly. Weary of repeating the Biden administration's 2024 mistake of projecting a sunnier picture of the economy than that reflected by consumer sentiment, and perhaps chastened by the, is that pronounced chastened or chastened? By the sweeping victories of 2025 Democratic candidates who ran on messages of affordability. Is there a pronunciation? Do I get to listen to this?
Chastening.
Chastening.
Chasten.
Chasten. Okay. Thank you. We learned something new today. To correct by punishment or suffering. To prune. Something such as a work or style of excess, pretense, or falsity. Discipline, purify, refine. Interesting. Okay. I see. Back to the news article. Now that we have learned a new word, or rather that I've learned how to pronounce that word, mistake perhaps chastened by the sweeping victories of 25 Democrats. Yes. Soon, both J.D. Vance and Ben Shapiro were telling a different story on the economy. When President Trump says things are becoming more affordable, people don't believe that, Shapiro said. Vance asked voters for patience. We get it and we hear you, and we know that there's a lot of work to do. Liberal fascism, ladies and gentlemen. The we hear you, we see you, we are you, or something like that. This is 21st century fascism. It's just liberalism again. It's just vice signaling edgier liberalism. It offers nothing to you. The only thing it offers is that it will deprive somebody else of something, which you will likely be deprived of too. And they'll do it in the same banal, institutional, alienating fashion that liberals do it, by rewriting some policy or rule or whatever. And now when you go to the, like, you know, collect your check or whatever, now it says, sorry, you won't receive this check anymore. Technically, it's the only thing stable for rich people. What is the only stable thing for rich people? Liberalism? Because yes. Yeah, that's why 21st century fascism is like this. The rich need to be able to keep their shit. Yeah, this is why fascism has mostly moved a lot closer to liberalism. It's a low bar to be able to merely contradict or disagree with the president. Nevertheless, it is noticeable that more and more Republicans are clearing it. Many of them have spent the better part of their careers at this point praising the emperor's new clothes. A few are going further. Among the most damaging scandals of the Trump era is a slow drip of revelations about the depth of friendship between Trump and Jeffrey Epstein, the dead financier and pedophile, and the accumulation of documents both from Trump to Epstein and by Epstein about Trump that suggests that Trump, in Epstein's parlance, knew about the girls. The Epstein saga, after all, had been a major fixture of the paranoid conspiracies in the far-right media ecosystem, whose podcast discords and YouTube channels helped drive Trump to victory in 2024. Yeah, this is mirroring the analysis that I just gave, right? Basically, they were aura farming off of Trump. And a big campaign thing in 2024 was release the Epstein files. And then all of a sudden, Trump doesn't want to release the files. They're beginning to learn. They're beginning to learn this. They are not. They have learned, and they are very good at acting in the interests of their own careers. It's like a single-celled organism reacting to stimuli in a one-dimensional sort of way. Their instinct is self-preservation, and they act on that instinct. They don't give two shits about anybody else. There's no broader social structure that these people actually care about beyond their own careers and their ability to lord over their domicile and abuse their wife and kids, right? So the average person, worse than the average person. As much as I will talk shit about the average person, and especially the average American, these people are worse. Nonetheless, they are a barometer that we should be taking note of here. So yeah, this article, I guess that was right at the end anyway. So yeah, there's more and more Republican officials and right-wing pundits are starting to break away from Donald Trump and his movement. And most of that results from the Epstein files. I wanted to find, though, some specific examples. That covers the institutional stuff, and it only mentions in passing the podcasts and YouTubers who are now sort of flipping all over each other over whether they are still loyal to or posing as more dissident from Donald Trump, right? I know that Benny Johnson has been like firing from the hip over, or not, maybe not Benny Johnson. Who was it? Benny Johnson was involved in this. I think it was Milo Yiannopoulos. The term you're looking for is to jump ship. Yes, thank you. That is another way of saying that. Milo Yiannopoulos, if anybody remembers, he's that gay guy who pretended to successfully pray the gay away or whatever. He pretends that he's not gay. And he has been like firing from the hip at other podcasters like Benny Johnson and shit. I saw that Tim Pool and Candace Owens are absolutely going at it. Benny Johnson is currently embattled with the allegations, devastating if you're on the right, that he is homosexual. He's repressing it. And there's nothing wrong with being homosexual. There is something wrong with repressing it. But to the right wing, they would fucking hate him if he were homosexual. So he's having to constantly try to tread water to that effect. MAGA world just seems to kind of be falling apart, right? Ben Shapiro has positioned himself as like very critical of Trump and such. You know, the unity that once existed for this like right-wing legion of content slop producers is kind of broken. Not along any real ideological lines, but rather along interpersonal and dramatic lines. You know, Trump no longer represents the same strong, charismatic leader that they initially saw him as. You know, they can't aura farm anymore off of Donald Trump. So now they're kind of turning on each other in an attempt to look for something else to aura farm off of. And of course, it tracks that they're going at each other's throats this hard. You know, fascists hate each other. They don't like each other. You know, I've talked about European politics enough to comment on this pattern several times, where far-right parties will hate working with other far-right parties, and really just with anybody. But, you know, that's why you see like, oh, such and such far-right party made a coalition government, and that coalition soon collapses because the far-right is just, they fucking hate each other. None of them like each other. And the same goes for politics in America. Now, America only has two parties, so the coalitions are kind of pre-assembled already. Um, but you do still see a lot of far right infighting because that's what the far right is great at. Leftist infighting is its own meme, but I promise you the leftists will never be as good at infighting and sowing discord in their own movements as the far right. Because on the left, there's a common project that people will agree upon. Sure, drama can get in the way of that, but at the end of the day, everybody will agree at various points, maybe not consistently enough to actually make systemic change. Plenty of leftist movements have failed, but eventually, people do come back to brass tacks. We got to lower housing costs. Housing is unaffordable. We need to decommodify it. People can't afford their rent. Healthcare is too expensive, right? Whatever the drama, there are political points of agreement that pervade through the left. That's what makes it the left. On the right, because of the pervading sentiment of hatred and psychosexual insecurity, their whole political identity revolves around the infighting. Trotskyists could never hope to be this good at infighting. And they're Trotskyists. And yeah, how often do you see a fascist smile in a way that's not like just smiling for the camera? Photo op, this politician is in front of the news cameras, so they do the politician kind of smile. These are profoundly miserable people, and they're looking to displace that misery and try to turn it into schadenfreude. Nothing helps a bad mood like spreading it around. They're trying to take that misery, that repressed tension, both sexual and non-sexual, and displace it and try to get some kind of satisfaction, catharsis, or release. I'm coming back to the psychosexual shit again. And they do this partly by, calling ice on their neighbors and vice signaling over hating minorities. But a lot of times they'll also eat their own. They'll turn against each other and say you're actually gay and homosexual and fake and gay again. you know yeah, they do. The reason they do that is to take their mind off of how depressing their own life is. That brief moment of catharsis, that high, it's something that they're chasing to forget my life fucking sucks. When in reality, you could be working on making your life and everybody else's life not fucking suck. And I promise you that if you make a significant part of your life into volunteer work and activism, your life is going to suck less just by virtue of trying to make it suck less for yourself and others. You know? Volunteering at the food bank is an extraordinarily nice experience. Phone banking for progressive candidates, even when you get like the angry phone calls swearing at you or whatever, that's a good experience. Because, underlying all of that, this is now me speaking from personal experience, underlying all of that is the motivation to go and do something with myself that contributes to making things better for other people. Clip? Clip what? Did me saying you should volunteer at the food bank and phone bank for progressive politicians like candidates? Yeah. Yeah, by all means, clip that. It's a good experience. You meet some nice people doing these things, you know? And that makes me feel good. a joke that part of it sounded bad. I don't get it. I'm gonna be real. Anyways, you guys get me. I'm probably preaching to the choir for anybody that watches my stream. This is likely not going to be a YouTube segment. Because I've got other shit lined up. Let me close that Guardian article because it's always in light mode. Is there any way to do dark mode with the Guardian? Doesn't seem immediately evident. Oh, goodness. Okay. Now we get to the heavier subjects. Yes, that is what qualifies for lighter subjects on stream. The heavier subjects are where I go into like some advanced philosophy type shit. I saw a thread that was actually interesting enough from a philosophical perspective to bookmark it. You guys remember how last stream, that part is going to be a segment where I argued that American Protestantism is gooning? This may occupy a similar vein to that. Here we go. This got me thinking. In fact, let's start here, and then I will work my way backwards. It starts with a premise. If all masculinity is patriarchal, then there can never be a man who is good, and therefore it is not worth trying to keep men from being raised to reinforce the patriarchy. All men automatically become the enemy. They are no longer people who can do good, they are just enemies. And somebody actually comments that, yes, purely by accident from first principles, this person has discovered gender abolition. Because if gender roles are enforced as a mode of hierarchy, then it is not possible to have a person that's capable of existing outside of it. That, if that makes sense. What am I listening to? You're listening to philosophy. This may, in the broader context of this thread, this may be serving a different rhetorical point, but consider this on its own, right? Consider that we're in a philosophy class. If all masculinity is patriarchal, then there can never be a man who is good, because patriarchy as a form of hierarchy is built on gendered domination and psychosexual control. If masculinity is defined by the hierarchical positioning within this hierarchy, then there's no such thing as a man who is good. That's what this is saying. And this is a correct if A then B, if B then C, therefore if A then C. This is like, this logically follows, right? All men automatically become the enemy. They're no longer people who can do good. They're just enemies. This is the part where I may slightly disagree. But if you replace all masculinity automatically becomes the enemy, then yes, if all masculinity is patriarchal, then there can never be a man who is good. Because if being a man is defined by your adherence to certain masculine traits, but these masculine traits are all deemed as masculine because they involve dominating another person. Essentially, if all masculinity is reduced to toxic masculinity, it's not possible to be a man and be a good person, right? And Beatrice gets into this later. The thread that I bookmarked gets into this later. But that's not me saying that all masculinity necessarily is toxic. What I am saying is that the scope of what is considered masculine is actually being reduced to more and more of its toxic elements, right? It used to be, right? You have the box. I'm going to use the box analogy. I've used this before when describing gender. You have this box called masculinity, and there are a number of things in that box. Some of them are very toxic traits. Some of them are positive traits, but together they comprise the box that is masculinity. This would be like, imagine that this box is slowly being stripped of its non-toxic elements. There are things that used to be considered masculine or acceptable in the range of what we would consider masculine gender identity that are no longer, because they're not deemed sufficiently toxic to remain in the box of masculinity, right? Even such things as having interest, the concept of having interest. I don't know if anybody's seen like right-wing slop accounts posting about this. This is an unfortunate cultural success that they've had, which is that even something as simple as having interest is now considered gay from the right-wing perspective, non-masculine, in a fashion that deserves derision from other people who are enforcing the social concept of masculinity, right? That's just the first post. Let's go back a bit. And Beatrice says, this is why men will be abolished. The male social class is increasingly obsolete as economic development brings an emphasis on labor unimpeded by sexual dimorphism. Before this happens, though, there will be crisis. Men will try to create ways to keep having a purpose, feudally. Basically, more and more things are becoming acceptable within the range of non-masculine or feminine behaviors, both in terms of interest and labor, the management and economy of nations, right? More and more of that is coming to be seen either in a not inherently masculine or in a feminine way. Therefore, that necessarily means that the scope of what is necessarily masculine is reducing. Men, as a social designation, the social designation of masculinity is becoming less and less relevant. It's becoming more obsolete because more things are being ejected from it, right? Having interest, working certain kinds of jobs, right? All of that, like many of those things used to be considered masculine traits or things that you could very easily associate with masculinity, with being a man. But now more and more of that is associated with femininity and being a woman. Men are slowly being abolished, right? This is, I believe, the thesis of gender abolition. We are yet to see the antithesis, right? Dialectical shit. And yeah, there's going to be crisis because this is going to cause a lot of anxiety. And in a world where these patriarchal hierarchies still exist, where there is still this gendered system, but gradually one very important element of that system is being stripped more and more of its social function and social role, they are going to experience a crisis of purpose. Anybody that belongs within that social label. Men are currently experiencing a crisis of purpose. I don't think that's a particularly controversial thing to say. And part of the reason for that is because more and more social functionality is being associated with womanhood. Fewer and fewer things that entail being socially functional are considered masculine. You know? Which means if you are masculine and subject to, the cultural masculinity police, not literally, but like in the sense of these cultural tones that sort of dictate, oh, if you're masculine, you should act this kind of way. These subtle social pressures are putting people in narrower and narrower limits, right? They are permitting them to do and be fewer and fewer things if they are men. Cannot imagine being a man. Must be rough for them. I can imagine. I was a man for almost 25 years, and it fucking sucked. I was raised as a boy. I didn't realize that I was trans until I was 23. I didn't realize that I was a trans woman until I was almost 25. And the whole experience was very, very, well, it was tumultuous. I have a lot of good childhood memories. I have a lot of bad childhood memories. There are a lot of things that I was actually afraid to do or engage in because that was seen as girls' stuff. But I did witness in real time, as I was growing up, more and more things that boys could do, that boys were socially kind of permitted to do, were also perfectly fine for girls to do. And I want to stress that that's not a problem. Breaking down these barriers in that way is not a problem. That's a good thing, actually. Girls should be, socially perfectly permitted to play the video games, to wear pants. Women used to not be allowed to wear pants in America, right? These barriers breaking down is good. The problem here, or what Beatrice is talking about, is these barriers are now being reconstructed one way. They're being reconstructed so that even though men enjoy certain institutional advantages, the pay gap, the sort of institutional inertia by virtue of social connections in these industries and whatever, leading to the average man earning more than the average woman, right? There are more and more social barriers that are confining men into a profoundly alienating, even if oftentimes financially comfortable existence. But there are an ever decreasing number of barriers to women. And there is currently, because of that dynamic, in the change in how we perceive gender and how gender is evolving, there is a literal reaction occurring, primarily in the social class that we call men. The male loneliness epidemic, the insistence that that's something necessarily male when it's, it's really everybody. But this more unique crisis of masculinity, crisis of masculine identity that men are experiencing. She continues. She actually made a full thread about this. And this is meant to get your noggin jogging, all right? We're jogging the noggin here. Men be like, I can't be friends with other men. That's gay. True. It sounds like a joke. That is one of the few things that is still socially permissible for a man to do, is be friends with other men. It is perceived as weird for a man to be platonic friends with a woman and to not have a sexual relationship. But additionally, increasingly it is becoming taboo for a man to like a woman, even if they are in a sexual or romantic relationship. The narrative that seems to be being created is that men are not allowed to be friends with people, that they must be miserable, right? Certainly that's not openly stated, but I feel like there is an undercurrent that is leading towards that. And if that is the case, then yes, the designation of man, the designation of masculinity, the social class of men is becoming obsolete and will eventually be obsolete. Men cannot have fun. Again, you joke, but there are literally people who will be, guys who just like video games or something, or some kind of like niche interest. They like reading such and such kind of book. They'll post about it, and some right winger will quote tweet them and be like, man, you have interest? That's gay. Which speaks to an ideological opposition to men having fun. Right? At least men having fun in a way that doesn't involve sexually dominating a woman. I don't know about you, but I've seen plenty of right-wingers who performatively engage in this sort of masculine policing, who do the whole, ha ha ha, that's gay type of shit and mean it unironically. I've seen plenty of them joke about rape. And, that's pretty consistent across them. They'll joke about the like sexual value of women or whatever, and consistently talk about women as objects. That seems to be untouched. It seems like the essence of patriarchal masculinity is being distilled down to its base elements, that being a man means you are only allowed to do things that either directly or result in dominating a woman, particularly sexually. Have they considered being gay is base? No, they haven't, because they don't have brains. Anyways, this is going to kind of be a retread of some of the things that I said. I want to make something clear. This is from Beatrice, Bastet's Passion. I also want to make something clear about the abolition of gender and why I say men and masculinity will be obsolete, but not that women and femininity will. My language isn't perfectly precise, but here's a thought process behind this. First, let's look at race as an analogy. So we have whiteness. And if you're familiar with its evolution as an international oppressive construct, you understand that whiteness is defined by what it excludes. Your language isn't precise, you don't say. Her language is more precise than most language that you've used in my chat. Give her a break. All right? If you're familiar with the evolution of whiteness, you understand that whiteness is defined by what it excludes. Whiteness must constantly avoid sharing things in common with non-whites. This is part of the reason that this sort of quasi-racial cultural pipeline exists, where things will gradually have to be subsumed into white culture and then become sort of dissociated with minority cultures in America. You know, where a lot of turns of phrase that are very common in the broader American lexicon, which is part of like institutional whiteness or whatever, this shit that you would hear a normal white person say who's like culturally in the know more or less, that stuff tends to drift away from marginalized communities over time, because now the white people have it and there's sort of an institutional pressure, or maybe not even institutional pressure. There's like the cultural pattern there is that just becomes part of white culture as distinct from Black culture, Hispanic culture, Asian culture, whatever in America, right? Like many scholars have talked about this. I am not one of those scholars, but this is pretty consistent with how whiteness is defined if you learn it as a concept of very amorphous but generally sort of race-associated cultural characteristics that change and are dictated by different things over time, right? So, whiteness must constantly avoid sharing things in common with non-whites. The class of men works this way. I was talking about this earlier. Men and masculinity is in a constant battle to minimize overlap with femininity. A man can't afford to have too much in common with women, or he is given fag status. You know, he gets called gay, in parentheses derogatory. We see gatekeeping of academia, of hobbies, of clubs, of workplaces against women's entry or participation at an institutional level, I should add. Because now what we're seeing is that a lot of guys are gatekeeping other guys from being able to acceptably socially broadcast that they are part of one of these things, you know? Being an academic, oh, that's gay, you're just a soy boy. Having a hobby, that's gay, that's like being a woman. Being part of a club, that's gay, you know, women do book club or some shit, you know? Does that make sense? Yes, this is not characteristic of a system that would hold it important for people to have rights and freedoms. It is a very strangely illiberal component of liberalism that patriarchy still remains. But institutionally, where men do have a certain degree of exclusivity in dominating a certain profession or dominating academia, there's a lot of gatekeeping of women at an institutional level. Basically learning about anthropology in college, you learn about some of the other social sciences as well, just because there's so many areas of overlap between the social sciences. You learn that basically it was very rare to see a woman in the social sciences because like they were either socially or sometimes legally not allowed to hold those jobs until basically the 20th century. And even then, they were very sharply looked down upon, often dismissed for irrational reasons. A lot of gatekeeping existed, but now that gatekeeping seems to go both ways, or one way for both genders, or something like that. Doctrinally, women are defined by our usefulness to reproduction. Again, this is part of like the patriarchal ideological zeitgeist, you know. It's always a history until 3 years ago didn't exist, basically. Something like that. Doctrinally, women are defined by our usefulness to reproduction, not just biologically, but also culturally. We are meant to be a catalyst on which men act to reproduce patriarchy. If we don't, patriarchy wants us raped, killed, or poor. This is the sort of objectification of women shit. I talked about how one of the only things that it remains acceptable for the most masculine men who are sort of performing that to do is joke about or act upon the sexual domination of women and the dehumanization of women, right? Yes, this is a thread because of the character limit. This is a very complex subject, and they're making thread to explore some of their thoughts on it. And the reason that you have these 1 out of 8, 2 out of 8 things is because there's a character limit. You can only have so many characters in a post. Yes, women, the class, is also becoming obsolete in that sense, but it's still different. Increasingly, femininity is eating many of masculinity's niches. Labor that is either mental or only somewhat physical is either shared by women or dominated by us. Other labor that still resists this feminization is still being made obsolete by technology, automation, and economies of scale. This is what I hinted at earlier that, again, I should have just let her cook because we were going to get to this anyway, that the scope of what men are allowed to socially and able to do is kind of shrinking by self-enforcement. Patriarchy is eating itself. You know, the mechanisms of social enforcement of masculinity are pigeonholing men into a smaller and smaller box that increasingly only contains toxic, unhealthy, domineering, and, well, patriarchal traits. Meanwhile, the label of femininity being everything outside of that patriarchal rule, like being not part of the top of that hierarchy, is subsuming more and more of those roles that were deemed to be not masculine enough for the current crop of men, right? Having interests and hobbies, being in academia, right? Increasingly, this is feminine coded because men as a class have come to drift further and further away from those things, leaving a vacuum. Or rather, it would have if femininity didn't sort of move and change to occupy that as well. And what labor did not go from masculine to feminine, simply went from masculine to automated and inhuman, and therefore neither masculine nor feminine, right? I wonder what caused them to post this out of the blue. We saw what caused them to post this. Keep up. Pay attention. The system knows that, which is why they're like, we should restrict rights for women. Yes. The reason that political reaction is the way it is, the reason why it has such a masculine bend to it, is that it is literally a crisis of masculinity. Men are losing purpose. And so, in a desperate, panicking struggle to find purpose, they are attempting to restrict the scope of purpose that women are allowed to have before potentially themselves trying to reclaim that. But that's not how that works. It's only viewed as feminine because, like, things that are viewed as feminine are only feminine because we insist that they are feminine and not masculine, right? Probably forgot. I'll watch this again later. That's fair. Some went from masculine to mixed. That's true. It's also the reason why performative stoicism is on the rise. Exactly. One of the many things that has been kicked out of the box of masculinity and increasingly subsumed into the purview of femininity is having emotions, expressing emotions, being able to healthily process your emotions. It used to be, the meme used to be in the 19th century that women were hysterical because they couldn't adequately process their emotions, not because they felt emotions, but because they weren't good at handling them. And that to be masculine would include properly processing your emotions. Was that actually true? No, but it was a component of the social labels of masculine and feminine, right? And so it was the sort of dominant cultural narrative from the patriarchal elite that percolated its way down, and in part that was reinforced from the bottom up, was that having healthy relationships with your emotions, being able to feel them, but not be so overcome by them that you crash out all the time, was a masculine thing. Now, things have drifted to the point where having emotions at all and feeling anything at all is perceived as a feminine thing. Remember when women used to get shocked from having periods? That was a thing. Oh yeah, in the socially prudish kinds of societies, I imagine it's like people don't necessarily tell you, yeah, you're gonna like bleed out of your vagina every month. So they probably were like, what the, you know? And when people were more peasant brained and didn't understand that it might have been like every time you get a period, it's like, holy shit, I'm bleeding from my vagina. Anyways, back to this thread. Other labor that still resist this feminization, still being made obsolete by technology, automation, and economies of scale. Must be the gods. So true. It must be that Athena has spite for my pussy in particular or something. I don't know. Masculinity needs a lot of exclusions. Needs a lot of exclusion to keep existing. Femininity, not nearly as much. That's why we've seen men becoming increasingly aimless and futile attempts at violent reversal. It's crazy the uterus rips itself apart instead of absorbing it back. That is kind of nutty, and humans are kind of unique in that respect. There are a lot of animals, there are a lot of mammals even, where the process that we know as a period, right? A menstrual or monthly kind of cycle with the reproductive organs, particularly the feminine ones, happens entirely internally, and there's no sort of external bleeding or anything like that. And what's even crazier is that a lot of it is also dictated not just by your reproductive, like the physical organs you have, but by the hormones in your body. Trans women have periods. Even if they haven't gone through any kind of bottom surgery to get like a vaginoplasty, trans women have been known to have periods that manifest as what they call a phantom pain. You experience the pain, but you don't have like, obviously those processes aren't really like happening, at least not the same way they would with a cis woman or somebody that has a vagina. You know, human reproductive system is pretty bananas. Femininity always referred to the remainder. That's true. In-group, out-group. In-group is defined by exclusion versus the out-group. Therefore, the out-group is defined by whatever the in-group does not deem as part of itself. And when the in-group is shrinking itself, that necessarily means that the out-group is growing. That's so true. Phantom Pain, Metal Gear reference, Kojima reference, literally Metal Gear Solid 5, Trans Women Edition. The Phantom Pain. It is actually called that, which is really funny. The femininity always refers to the remainder. The scraps of social and economic roles men weren't taking. Now it is breaking out and turning more things into feminine things simply by having significant, not even always an overwhelming majority, participation from women. Kojima makes my gears solid. Mine too. So true, bestie. The niche trying to be carved out by positive masculinity will either perish because it wasn't actually all that positive, even after so much heavy revision, or else be given over to femininity by the one drop rule of gendered social roles. The future is either feminine or cataclysm. I actually think this makes a disturbing amount of sense. And I don't mean disturbing as in, oh my God, it's so scary. I mean disturbing as in it literally disturbed me from my seat and caused me to sit there and think about it, right? Right? I don't mean like emotionally, well, I do, in some sense, I do mean emotionally disturbing because I felt some emotions reading this, like confusion and like, curiosity. Um, but I don't mean disturbing in a negative way, if that makes sense. It basically it made the noggin start jogging. It got the gears turning. It made me think of Kojima, which makes my gears solid. Thank you. Uh, made my Metal Gears solid. Excuse me. Um, and I think that like if you understand the dialectical relationship just in theory, if you understand like what a dialectic is, where you have thesis and antithesis, and how a lot of times where dialectics are systemically reflected in the real world, they are with class or systems that revolve around inequality. This makes a lot of sense. If the nature of men and women are a dialectic in a patriarchal system, where men are the thesis, the in group that has power and control and gets to dictate certain terms, the in group, and women are the out group, masculinity and femininity being thesis and antithesis, then this is the dialectic approaching a resolution where it's not to say men and women will be equal. I don't think that's like necessarily what's even happening here, because that necessitates the remainder of the labels of men and women, which are defined by being unequal to each other in the roles that they occupy. I think this speaks to the dialectical road that like leads to the resolution of a conflict between thesis and antithesis, which means that they both cease to exist and become synthesis, right? You have thesis, antithesis in a dialectic, the two meet, they obliterate each other, and they produce a new thesis, the synthesis, right? The contradictions between masculinity and femininity are sharpening. Femininity is coming to represent more and more things that are positive, normal, and socially functional and characteristic of people as like social units, right? Who have interest, who feel emotions, who have friends, who want to spend time with each other, who, do all that sort of stuff. Meanwhile, masculinity is increasingly being colored by this performative online like stoicism and calling anything non-masculine, right? Like it seems that masculinity is kind of shrinking in the degree to which it is able to exclude femininity from the things that it does and has, right? My opinion was that it was interesting. I think that is all I want people to walk away with this, from this with, is that this is interesting. And yeah, so okay, this person asks, what happens when the 4 billion or so men become obsolete? When masculinity becomes obsolete, do they just die? No. The answer is they cease to be men. They cease to be masculine because the social roles of gender cease to exist. They become something else entirely. We potentially even just shed this vestigial system without really replacing it with much of anything. or maybe we do replace it with something. But one thing's for sure, it's not going to be the same thing that yielded this. I also want to contribute to this. The part of the reason that I think that there's a point here, masculinity is shrinking and femininity is growing. There's historical evidence to that effect. You can look at any institutional demographics in the social sciences, in government, in corporate representation, and there are more women composing these institutions and acting as part of and on behalf of these institutions now than there were in the past, right? Femininity is advancing in this dialectic. And by virtue of that, because masculinity is defined by being an in-group with control over these institutions, patriarchally so, being literal patriarchs, the advance of femininity means a retreat of masculinity. Femininity is growing, masculinity is shrinking. And one of the things I saw here that, made me think like, oh shit, there's really something to this, is that not only that, the term positive masculinity, I think itself seals the fate of masculinity. I think that this makes the whole argument. The fact that masculinity has come to a point where you have to specify not toxic masculinity, but positive masculinity. The fact that now that is the thing that needs to be prefaced, that needs to be specified about masculinity. And that more people are feeling the need, real or implied, and I do believe that it is real, to specify positive masculinity as opposed to just regular masculinity, means that masculinity is shrinking, becoming more toxic, and therefore becoming more obsolete, because being toxic does not provide social utility to the world, right? That's kind of what being toxic means. You're a hater. Being a hater can be funny at times, but like, a lot of times that shit ain't even funny, because being funny is like gay or something. Is that why we got that one lesbian fascist in Germany? It might actually be. Even the retreating masculinity represented by fascist hatred of women cannot escape being represented by a woman. Every day my repulsion for most men grows more justified. I'm right there with you, sister. Yeah, like legitimately, I think that this is kind of like a smoking gun for this thread. That like the increasing prominence of having to justify masculinity by attaching the word positive in front of it already accepts that masculinity itself isn't positive, and you have to attach that to it in order for it to have positive traits. Does that make sense? How big of a phenomenon will this be once it all crashes? I have no idea. Characteristic with a lot of philosophical discussions of dialectics like this is that you can sort of see the contradictions sharpening. You can see the thesis and antithesis growing, shrinking, changing, and approaching a point where they will have to do synthesis or otherwise collapse in cataclysm and then produce synthesis. But I have no idea what that's going to look like. Just like we can see the ways in which a capitalist system, an economic system, is acting in ways that are irrational, that are not sustainable, that are transparently counter to the purpose of an economic system, which is meeting human needs, right? We can view those contradictions sharpening in real time. And we can predict reasonably that at some point, this will no longer be the way things are, because it would be impossible for this to remain the way things are in human society. But I don't know what the end of that looks like. I don't know what a socialist world looks like necessarily. There are a lot of different ways it could look. I'm not as well read on gender abolition and gender theory, so I'm not as familiar with potential hypothetical scenarios of gender abolition or gender reconciliation, which would functionally still be abolition. But I know that that world eventually will be upon us. And I'm sure that there are plenty of scenarios that people have predicted as to what that might look like. Truly, yeah, another we are inevitable moment. The gender abolitionists, I think, are like gonna be eaten pretty good soon. I just have the mindset we'll figure it out as we go. Yeah. My vote is that either people go full mainly fascist or it disintegrates because it's not sustainable. I think both of those things are going to happen in that order. I think that the reaction is going to become more severe as masculinity retreats and shrinks further and further. As femininity comes to represent more and more of society, particularly its sociable, non-toxic elements. And I think that is going to motivate people who still remain in the label of masculinity to be incredibly fascist and reactionary. And they're going to go out with a bang, or maybe they go out with a whimper, but it will disintegrate because that's not sustainable. Yeah, to use an example people would be familiar with, it is like Hitler in the bunker. He chills in his bunker. Things are actually like visibly collapsing around him for the German Reich or whatever. And then eventually he offs himself. You know? And this person says something that also gives me food for thought. These are a lot of words just to get across the point that eventually men will have to stop caring about being seen as gay or feminine. This would be a path to survival of masculinity, potentially. But no, I actually don't think that this is possible. I don't think that it is possible for men to stop caring about being seen as gay or feminine because masculinity only exists in contrast to femininity. They are thesis and antithesis. They are defined. Their existence is defined by not sharing traits with the other one, at least from the direction of masculinity. And if this person is correct and this ends up happening, which I believe are actually two different things. You know, this person could be correct and this doesn't happen, or this person could be incorrect and this does happen. I think that if in the world where this actually reaches a peaceful resolution of like the good ending, men realize it's actually fine to be gay and fruity and all that and do feminine things too. That is still gender abolition because it facilitates the further destruction of barriers between the social identities of each gender. Let's hope it doesn't end in the day of the rope or something. Well, let's hope indeed. But personally, I don't think it will. But again, you know, I can't see the future. I've said this plenty of times. I can't predict how this will end, but I think it will end with gender abolition, basically. Although a lot of people do have a kind of small brain about the word abolition specifically because they think of the abolition of slavery, which is something that could be written down in a law and enforced by cops. Most abolitions are not like that. Most abolitions at a social level are things that have to be so encoded into the social fabric of society that it's unthinkable that they would ever need to be written into law or enforced by the power of state. A symptom of it is femboys, I'd wager, and seeing how femboys integrated into fascism is probably a smoking gun too. I think, yeah, I think so too. I think, you know, the attempt to reclaim elements of femininity into what is acceptable in the masculine fold is sort of a symptom of this happening, right? Because femboys are basically like, it's a sign of like what I was referring to earlier, where a lot of times uh, uh, the far right men that post online about everything being fake and gay will call you gay if you like women. But liking femboys somehow to them is not gay. But sometimes it is gay. So either way, with this contradiction, that sort of feeds back into the ever shrinking exclusivity of masculinity. Yeah, that's right. It is kind of like looking for a desperate escape to not feel defeated. Femboys actually might have been one of the last aspirational attempts of masculinity to have something positive that wasn't just dominating women. And that kind of failed. Honestly, because of this thread, right? And because of the phenomena that Beatrice describes in this thread, this honestly, if I had to be a little bit of a Nostradamus about this, right? This makes me think we are way the fuck closer to a gender abolition world than anybody would have thought up to this point, right? If we keep going in this direction, it's going to be messy, but I would doubt if there's a particularly rigid sense of gender by the time somebody my age would be having grandkids, or maybe great grandkids, or great great grandkids. We're talking in the orders of magnitude of 50 to 200 years before the world is basically unrecognizable from a patriarchal perspective of gender. That's my thinking. And again, I'm trying to predict that as order of magnitude, like as orders of magnitude, right? But the fact that I could even conceive of seeing something like this come to a head, come to a like dialectical head within my lifetime at all is like both a brain buster and like kind of groundbreaking. I like legitimately one of my first reaction to this was I quote tweeted and said, I want to see like a philosophical paper written by a professional academic on this subject. I'd be kind of surprised if somebody hadn't written on this already because of how obvious it seems in retrospect, but like there's something here. And I think it's actually going to be pretty important, especially when you understand how psychosexual politics is and how much of it is actually motivated by these things that compose gender identity, that govern people's behavior, with things as basic as which people you're allowed to be attracted to, what interests you're allowed to have, what professions you're allowed to take part in, whether the things you do are viewed as like masculine or feminine coded, and the moral weight that confers to your character by virtue of your pre-existing associations. Freud. It's true. It's Freud again. He's back. He's back and stronger than ever. Maybe Freud was right. Yeah, Freud was right about a lot of things. He had some good analysis to offer. Psychology students in shambles. Why would they be Jungian? I actually don't think Jungian analysis is as useful as Freudian analysis at times. You have to use elements from both, obviously, right? But like, there are a lot of things um that come from a Freudian or pseudo-Freudian analytical framework that if you contradict that framework straight up, you basically forfeit any chance of accurately encapsulating the issue you're talking about. For example, the psychosexual motivations that play out in people's heads when they are making political decisions and when they're voting or deciding what to prioritize in their politics, right? And a lot of that comes from sexual repression, something that, even though not having read Freud, I know Freud talked about at length. Where the other psychologists, the other foundational psychologists are at their strongest is where they're not like directly contradicting the sort of psychosexual analysis that, to my knowledge, Freud had a significant hand in developing, and obviously Wilhelm Reich as well. Strasser is homo-fascism. That's true. That's facts. The only thing I could see giving masculinity any sort of fuel beyond this point, honestly, is homo-fascism, where everything comes to bear the label of gay parentheses derogatory, except actually being gay and loving other men, you know, and fucking other men. Note the strands. That's true. I think, no, legitimately though, I think there's something to that. The only, like, that's not even going to make masculinity last forever. But like, if you love men so much, why don't you just fuck and marry men? Is kind of the only thing that masculinity could turn to. Yeah, they would actually have to go back to the fucking homosexual ancient Greece type shit, which would unfortunately also include pedophilia, which is another congruous part of the like sexual domination elements of masculinity. You know, that fucking freak psychosexual control and shit. Profoundly interesting thread, I think. It actually felt kind of liberating reading that. I'm not gonna lie. You know, it was a little bit like, yeah, it ain't like the you know, as if the right wasn't pedophilic already. You know, um, it felt kind of liberating reading that thread. It felt kind of like intellectually affirming in my decision to transition finally. Um, you know, which is always nice. You'll be like, how do I be a man? And I'm like, I'm playing Pikmin. That's true. Yeah, it, you know, there's kind of like it, if you ask for guidance or any sort of advice, how do I how do I be a man? Right? Question that it like in plenty of 20th century and early 21st century media was like not that uncommon of a question for like kids coming of age or something like that, boys coming of age. And there was like, well, you see, you know, being a man means you blah, blah, blah. And a lot of times there were sort of affirmative things that ostensibly were good, that you should aspire to, that you should do, that would make the lives of people around you better. And they were like, and that's what it means to be a man. Patriarchal connotations of gender aside, there were affirmative aspirations that were good and that were like altruistic, that were considered pretty ubiquitously, that used to be considered pretty ubiquitously, component parts of being a man, coming of age as a man. But increasingly, those were de emphasized over time, particularly because of the cultural avatar of masculinity. The people that started to be asked, how do I be a man, increasingly were not people who embodied these aspirational traits, but rather people who embodied the domineering traits. And so that came to define masculinity. Yeah, fascism is responsible for the death of masculinity in whatever way it held value. Positive masculinity used to exist as an integral part of masculinity. Fascism killed it in its desire to dominate and only to dominate. It excised all of the aspiration and desire to do good for others and the world out of masculine identity to construct the perfect fascist man, the fascist man who only seeks to dominate. And what do we know about fascism? It destroys itself. It's an inherently self-destructive ideology. And because it focuses so much on masculine identity, when it succeeds in any degree in intertwining itself with masculinity, with masculine identity, that's going to make masculinity that much more self-destructive too, which is going to have a feedback loop. Further proof that liberals are the better fascists? I don't know. I was just thinking about how liberals talk about gender. I don't know if that's true. A lot of what I've heard liberals talk about with respect to gender is sort of also sort of contributes to the isolation of men. In the sense that they also sort of fixate on the negative traits of masculinity. They sort of reinforce what the fascist is trying to do in co-opting masculine identity. Yet again, liberals come to the rescue of the fascist, where the fascist is like, this is what being a man means. And the liberals' response is not, no, it isn't, but rather, that's gross. We don't want that. Will represent women. You know? So I guess they're sort of hastening the dialectic. You kill more people, they're more self-sustaining. Oh. Yeah, I guess in that way they would be just better at doing fascism. Especially because, you know, the fascies, the hatchet and sticks is also, that's not just a symbol of fascism. Remember the video that I made a few years ago, fascism is inherently an anti-art ideology, so it has to crib from other ideologies. The fasces is a liberal symbol. Liberté, égalité, fraternité. The fasces represents that. Do you have a Discord? Yes, I do. You can type !Discord for the Discord. In fact, let me look this up. French Revolution fasces. Symbolism in the French Revolution. Yeah, look, here it is. Right here. There it is. The fasces. That is actually the name of this thing. The object, the symbol for which the ideology of fascism is named, is a derivative of Enlightenment liberalism. Liberté, égalité, fraternité. Lâche et le fagot. Mussolini was cooking something? Maybe he was. Sometimes you think Mussolini might have been cooking purely because he was Italian. So it makes sense. It makes sense that there'd be a lot of overlap between liberalism and fascism. Fascism came from liberalism, as did in many ways modern socialism. You know, you edit this picture a little bit, that'd be a good video game weapon. It already contains a thing that's a weapon in a lot of video games. A hatchet. This is a bunch of sticks bundled around a hatchet, which is already a weapon. It could also function as a halberd if you're brave enough. I know my point still stands. Oh, you mean like if instead of a bundle of sticks here, this would like this whole thing was the handle and it just had a little thing up here? I see what you mean. Mussolini sometimes feels like not that bad of a guy, but like that conservative Southern European uncle that likes alcohol, cars, and women a bit too much. You know, he does feel a little bit like that, especially with his quote that racism, it is not fact, it is feeling. And then later he was like, Italians should proclaim themselves to be racist. He does feel a little bit like that, especially with the video clip of him doing that. Let me see if I can find that. God, it's so good. It's so good. Here, hold on. Oh my God. They're calling him the funniest fascist to have ever lived. Him doing the helicopter hand was so funny. Oh yeah, that's true. Early on, Mussolini wrote about how fucking crazy Hitler was. Uh, I feel like maybe this is gonna be a segment. I feel like there's too much interesting philosophical discussion here and like laughing at Mussolini for me to not make this a segment. We've got all the check boxes. Trans women, check. Twitter, check. Laughing at how funny Mussolini was, check. Dogging on liberalism, check. Men bad, check. Philosophy, check. Leftist meme, check. I don't know. I think it checks plenty of boxes there. But I do have to like put an end to the segment sooner or later. So I'm gonna put my foot down and say, future me, cut it. We got to move on. We got to move on. I the last thing I had, the one other thing I wanted to talk about. This is gonna be the YouTube people are in for like a wild fucking ride. Because I feel like the next two segments that are gonna come out are gonna be the Protestantism is literally gooning segment, and then the men are literally going to be abolished segment, which is kind of crazy. I'm not gonna lie. Um, but if nothing else, it'll be funny and it's good fodder for people to type up a storm in the comments for me to then not read. Um, yeah, I wanted to look at something that like is actually kind of upsetting to me, but nonetheless, it is important. Um, r/teachers. Let's go to r/teachers. I think this getting testimonials from teachers seems like a lot of things get me upset. Yeah, I mean, bad things tend to upset me sometimes, right? And when I get upset, that it feels like I'm more passionate in like talking about it, which makes for good content. So there's kind of a disproportionate there's like a bias, you know? That's so good. That's so true. Kayla the furry thing that you just sent me. Oh fuck yeah. I love this genre of meme, by the way. It's great. However, I do have a dedicated channel for shit posts, so hopefully we can do our shit posting there. It'll be great. um. Anyways, let me open up r/teachers and look at this thing that I wanted to look at, particularly regarding illiteracy and the literacy crisis in America, which is not just an America thing. It's not just a thing in America. It is happening elsewhere, but characteristic of a number of socioeconomic crises that face the world. America seems to get it way worse because our economy is fake and gay. Teachers, r/teachers. What caused the illiteracy crisis in the US? Educators, parents, whoever, I'd love your theories or opinions on this. I'm in the US, Central Florida to be exact. I've been seeing posts on here and other social media apps, hearing stories in person from educators about this issue. I genuinely don't understand. I want to help my nephew to help prevent this in his situation, especially since he has neurodevelopmental disorders, the same ones as me, and I know how badly I struggled in school despite being in those gifted programs which don't actually help the child. Not getting into that rant, based, by the way, fuck gifted programs. That's a whole other post. I don't want him falling behind, getting burnt out or anything. Gifted programs are bad. Yes, they are. Gifted programs, right, are inherently antisocial and pro-hierarchy. If a kid is really smart and aces all the class material, let them ace the class material. That way, hey, that's another way that they can socialize with the class. They could be like, wow, you're so smart. You could help the other kids. You know? Maybe there's some kids that are struggling. Kid that's really smart and excels and is like breezing through all the material. You understand this well enough. Why don't you go help that kid that's having a harder time, right? The reason that gifted programs exist is to separate the kids who have resources from the kids that don't. There's not always a perfect overlap between kids that are smart enough to be in the gifted program and kids that are like wealthy and part of like upper middle class or wealthy, or like owning class adjacent kind of families. But the overlap is strong enough for it to be a measure of economic segregation, right? Gifted programs are usually determined by grades, test scores, and like quantified performance, which is directly correlated to income and like resources available to the kid and their family, right? Which means it tracks pretty statistically consistently that the kids in the gifted program will be much wealthier on average than the kids that are not in the gifted program. And the reason for that existing is to perpetuate that divide, to ensure that the wealthy kids are afforded proper educational resources and taken through the education system in a way that guarantees that they will be able to run the system when they become integrated into the upper class. And so that the kids outside of the gifted program are not afforded those same resources and are almost guaranteed to be part of the working class. You know? We don't have a gifted program, but we have special ed, and putting a highly neurotic and smart autistic kid next to a kid with Down syndrome is an explosion recipe. That's true. Special ed programs and special needs programs are also like a can of worms, but I feel like there's more justification for programs like that to exist. So long as they don't like radically disrupt the social landscape of kids' lives and like prevent them from socializing with other kids. As long as they don't do that, as long as they don't like socially segregate kids in the opposite direction, creating a small underclass, right, in school, then I think special needs programs are fine, because it is possible that, you know, a kid has a learning disability where the normal pace of the class might be too much, or like assignments aren't always like by default very easy for them to do so much as it is for other kids, right? particularly thinking of people with more physical disabilities. I remember in middle and high school, I had a few classmates who had cerebral palsy. Um, and I think the correct version, I believe, of a special needs or special ed program is the one that this one guy I was friends with in middle school who had cerebral palsy was in. He had a milder form of it where he walked in a like I'm sure people probably remember there's like a kid that has a palsy or something, like one of those disorders that causes them to walk or run in a really goofy kind of way, and actually to sometimes do like the stereotypical thing with their arm because they don't like have full control over their muscles or something. But he was in like normal school classes. They just afforded him a little bit extra help to keep up with the other kids, and like he wasn't cordoned off into like the special ed classroom where you weren't really like mingling with the other kids. I think that's a good way to do it. Nonetheless, that's a whole separate topic. I'm here to talk about literacy, illiteracy, and the absolute state of the education system. And I got sidetracked by the mention of gifted programs and special ed programs. My friend's mother is an elementary school teacher. This woman's a literal saint, and she has noticed. She has even noticed an extreme downward trend in literacy abilities over the last 10 years or so. Kids who are nearing middle school age with no disabilities being unable to read, not doing their work even when it's on the computer or tablet so they don't have to write, since many kids just don't know how, and having little to no grammar skills. Typo. It's genuinely worrying me since these kids are our future. We need to invest in them as opposed to just passing them along just because. Is it the parents, lack of required reading time, teaching regulations being less than adequate, or something else? Uh, uh, this has been bothering me for a while, and I want to know why this is happening so I can avoid making these mistakes with my own future children. I haven't been in the school system myself in years, so I'm not too terribly caught up on this stuff. So my perspective may be a little bit outdated. Some people I knew in special ed called it their personal concentration camp. I was in special ed, and I'm not going to lie, sometimes it did feel a little bit like that to me. I was a special ed kid because of my autism diagnosis. Um, and luckily, for some of the like, for most of the time that I was in high school and in special ed, it was just like a special ed homeroom class. And I just went to normal classes, but it like the homeroom class, it was like, oh, there's enough kids to populate this homeroom class. So we can have a teacher that specializes in special education with special needs kids, autistic kids, and so forth. And so, we were all, buddy buddy, we were friends, we were talking, and the teacher was like specially trained to know how pedagogy and childhood education works with kids like that. But for the rest of the time, I would intermingle with other kids. But at times, before I had that teacher who was really cool, and after that teacher left, it did sort of feel like the designation of special ed was like you're being socially segregated downwards, you know? Because and I had an aversion to it. For the longest time, I had a massive chip on my shoulder about invoking like this special education plan. There was like a packet that outlined like rights and protections that I had as a student that like, oh yeah, since you have maybe some extra trouble with homework or with taking tests, you could be afforded extra time if you want. You can go to the teacher, ask for some extra time as long as you're trying to do the assignment. Yeah, it basically felt like the designation of Untermensch. And because of that, I never wanted to use, it was either, I think it was an IEP program, which again is meant to help special needs kids so that they don't like drastically fall behind when they're in normal classes. But even having to invoke that in my mind brought to mind that like, shit, I'm just the Untermensch now, you know? So I never did. I don't think I ever invoked my IEP plan for that shit. Yeah, meant to being the operative. Meant to does a lot of heavy lifting there, you know? And shit, I don't necessarily object to an outlining of rights and protections for special ed kids that, you know, they can't try to force you through at a breakneck pace, right? I think there was just something about the social expectation of the time that, like, and the way that special ed classes act as a sort of downward social segregation for kids, that it really felt like the Untermensch designation. I think that, like, an IEP packet that says, you know, you can have extra time, you can, you know, be sure to ask other kids for help, blah, blah, ask the teacher for help, they'll be able to help you, etc. I think that stuff is good for kids that we can specifically recognize might struggle in the education system. And I think the thing that probably made the chip on my shoulder develop was the sort of social separation of the special ed kids from the rest of the kids. When I hear stories about these kids, it makes me think, wow, I thought I was good. Yeah. Enough about my own personal experiences. Let's get back to how cooked the kids are nowadays. Multiple factors are at play here. Back around NCLB, No Child Left Behind, signing into law, there was some new literacy initiative peddled by a woman who pulled focus away from phonics and toward whatever hellscape she came up with. I don't remember who it was or what the program was, but it's been talked about a lot on here. So I'm sure someone can shed a light on that. So a huge problem is the kids are relying on rote memory of sight words, which works for irregular words. But once you get to higher levels, you rely on being able to decode the phonics to figure out the word. I've had kids struggle with words like pivot and fulcrum because they don't really understand how to break down unfamiliar words and sound them out. Basically, what they're getting at is part of the deterioration is driven by, well, NCLB, as far as I know, like, one image in it that says child left behind. That's so true. NCLB refers to this law that was meant to get kids through the education system quicker, but the prioritization was graduation rates and not whether kids actually fucking learned anything. Because what they were optimizing for is augmenting the workforce. They wanted to produce workers. They didn't want necessarily well-educated kids. And because this was a Republican policy, I would wager that they specifically didn't want kids to be well-educated. That's NCLB. This literacy initiative, basically phonic memory means etymology. I learned etymologically how certain words worked. Most of my etymological grammar ed was like really basic shit in elementary school, and then maybe more complicated shit in high school. That's where most of my knowledge of grammar structure comes from, is my years in high school. And I've retained a lot of that, thankfully. And so what this person is saying is that this new model de-emphasizes recognizing the building blocks of words and the linguistic parts of, like, oh, this part of the word means this and this part of the word means this. So you put them together and that means this. Or you have the whole word, which you know what it means, but then you can break it down into this part meaning this and this part meaning this, and that makes sense. Now it's just, you've seen the word before and you know specifically what that word means. So you can remember this word means this. There's very little critical thought involved. Basically, you see a word and you remember it later, but have no actual knowledge of why the word is spelled a certain way or what the component parts of it may mean. You simply recognize the word itself from, as this person says, rote memory. That's how I was taught, sadly. Yeah, a lot of kids, apparently, I'm learning this more and more. Apparently, I was like one of the last waves of kids to go through the education system that were taught not like this. I didn't learn like this. For some words, you do have to use rote memory because they're so basic that they don't really have component parts. Certain prepositions, for example. A, the, in, out. But these pivot and fulcrum are clearly words that have etymological structure beyond just 2 or 3 letters, right? I'm not as familiar with the etymological structure of the word fulcrum, but pivot, piv, I recognize from certain other words. It's been long enough that I couldn't tell you what it meant, but I know what to look for and how to look that up. A lot of kids are not even being taught this concept that words can be composed of building blocks that are used in other words and that have common meanings. That's just number one. Number two that they mention, parents aren't as involved for various reasons. They might even be well-intentioned, but they aren't reading to their kids as much and aren't encouraging it either. Books have been replaced by YouTube and TikTok. Bam. That's the big one. Kids are not reading anymore. Parents are not reading anymore. They're not reading to their kids. They're not teaching their kids how to read. It may seem small, but the de-emphasis, fork found in kitchen, the de-emphasis of reading has led to people not being able to read. Excuse me, I might have said read there. I remember when I was going in kindergarten, which is the class right before first grade, right, in K-12 education. It's the first year, is where I remember learning how to read and write. We would learn the letters of the alphabet. This is how you write this in uppercase. This is how you write this in lowercase. This is the motion that you make to write these letters in upper and lowercase. You start learning basic vocabulary. You start learning sentence structures. You start learning oh yeah, this is how to write a sentence. This is how to write a paragraph. This is what a paragraph is. A paragraph is a collection of sentences that has a common idea, not ideological, but ideative thread. I might have even just made that word up, but I did it because I have a certain knowledge of etymology that allows me to construct words that should make sense, right? Basically, a paragraph is a collection of words that contains a consistent idea or sub-idea, And I learned this in kindergarten. I would relearn it and apply it over the subsequent grades. But what I want to point out is that my childhood experience was one where my parents read to me. They read me bedtime stories and stuff. I already had a basic degree of literacy entering kindergarten. I could read, I could write. That shirt, have you guys seen the shirt that I wear sometimes that just says advertisement over and over and over again? 4-year-old me wrote that. I knew what the word advertisement was, what it meant, and how to spell it, and and the connotation of what function it served when I was 4 years old, before kindergarten. Why? Because my parents read to me and fostered an intellectual curiosity that caused me to ask them what that meant. And how to spell it, too. I asked my parents, I remember this. I asked my parents, how do you spell advertisement? 4-year-old me, you may notice there's a scribble on the first advertisement on that t-shirt. It says advertisement a bunch of times. The first one has a scribble right where the S should be. I thought advertisement was spelled with a Z because that's how it sounds phonetically. My dad corrected me. I remember I think he was there when I was writing this down. He was like, oh, here, you spell advertisement with an S, not a Z. It's weird, but sometimes the S makes the Z sound. I would learn more about that later, but then that's why the later words, advertisement, on that t-shirt are spelled correctly. And I corrected the first one. Oh, okay, advertisement is spelled like this. Let me express how much I hate advertisements. 4-year-old me was fucking based. But that was a common childhood experience. It was perfectly normal for parents to read to kids and for me to be able to read kind of when I got to kindergarten. Now, from what I've been seeing increasingly, all of the social structures, all of the parental structures, educational structures, social structures that were responsible for building up that literacy, intellectual curiosity, and so forth in my brain at a young age are no longer present. There are kids at like 8th grade, middle and high school. These kids are pretty close, like relatively speaking, to entering the world as adults, and they can't read at the level I was reading when I was 4 years old. That's not me talking myself up. I have fond memories, so I will recall them fondly. I was not especially intelligent as a 4-year-old compared to other 4-year-olds, I promise you. I merely mentioned that to connect personal experience and to highlight how worrying this trend is. I haven't even gotten past the first response to this post. But the fact that social media has replaced books in the early cultural and pedagogical lexicon of children and families generally is like society ending. I have come full circle on this. I used to be very positive on social media, right? I was a firm believer in the utility that social media could serve to the world because I had met plenty of queer people around my age who came out on social media first because of abusive home environments. And I had seen firsthand the utility that that could provide. But you have to recognize, as I do now, two things. Number one, even if that utility still exists, it has long since been absolutely dwarfed at a gargantuan level by the anti-utility of declining literacy, declining critical thinking, and so on. And I would argue, number two, the ability of social media and the internet to provide a safe space for queer youth doesn't really exist anymore. Increasingly common of a phenomenon on Twitter, a mainstay of social media, is for queer kids to be bullied to the point of killing themselves. Billions must read and write poetry and understand it. True. For the benefit of society, they're just going to have to tough it out. No, that's not my position. My position is actually, I thought that to deprive queer kids of social media would mean telling them to tough it out. But I think that you could make a pretty solid argument that not allowing children to access the internet until they can demonstrate a certain level of reading comprehension, and critical thinking skills is also better for the queer kids. Like, will lead to less harm directly in the short term and indirectly in the long term for queer kids. Like, it's just bad on all fronts, I think, now. And I think that's because, like, social media and the internet has consolidated and become AI laden and overrun so quickly that even my late 2000s to early 2010s vision of what the internet is, that was about the time that I started using the internet a lot more. That was the impression that the internet left on me initially when I was much more cognizant of what I was doing and what these websites were for, is already hopelessly outdated, you know? And rationally, I understand that. But my earlier takes on this subject several years ago were motivated by a 2010s and early 21st century understanding of what the internet was and how it related to society. We're a bit deeper into the 21st century, and the internet has been sufficiently overridden in whatever social, like positive social function it served. I don't think that's the case anymore. Legitimately, I think that institutions of lawmaking would be justified in just banning the internet from being used by anybody under the age of 15, say. Is that kind of arbitrary? Sure. But it is so thoroughly detrimental to education, especially to have the internet present in the classroom. I think at the very least, the internet should not be easily accessible when you are at school. School should be a place of learning. If there's anything I like grew up and understood a lot better about how my parents raised me, right? It was the limitations on screen time. Uh, when I was a teenager, they took off that limitation once they thought I understood well enough how to interact with these things and that I could be responsible with doing my schoolwork and other such stuff. I think that might have even been too early for them to do that. But the fact that they put a limit on how much I was allowed to let, television, particularly video games and the internet, influence my childhood social development, I think is a good thing because it encouraged me to find other forms of having fun that were more intellectually engaging for the most part and involved more critical thinking than just watching a YouTube video. You know? On a side note, the literacy issue is also a problem in math. This is what's known as numeracy. Literacy refers to the ability to read literature, words being written. And numeracy refers to your ability to read numbers, mathematical things. My numeracy is much weaker than my literacy. I make jokes about this plenty, but I do still have numeracy skills. This person says, continues here, my mom teaches middle school math and their curriculum does not allow for teaching algorithms. They focus so much on number theory and why things work that they don't teach kids the quick mental math tricks. She sneaks them in at the end of her official lessons, and she saw significant growth just by reintroducing algorithmic math, the tricks like moving decimal points when moving through metric conversions, for example. You're not allowed to tell kids as part of the curriculum that if you want to multiply by 10, just move the decimal or add a zero. Every sentence I read, it gets more cooked. They're trying to make people stupid on purpose. Yes, they are. That's the purpose of No Child Left Behind. So that increasingly getting an education in a public school does not guarantee that you actually learn. Yes, you heard that right. Number theory, why things work, they don't actually teach kids the mental math tricks. That's like these mental math tricks are not part of the curriculum in, I don't know if America broadly is a fair characterization, but certainly in this school district, in various school districts, they are moving away from mental, like mathematical shorthands and things that can allow kids to, yeah. Her curriculum also gives math instruction and practice using only word problems. So not only can they not do mental math, they can't read or understand the questions. Oh no, especially if the student is EL. I don't know what EL stands for, but okay. Lucy Calkins, that's the witch's name. Oh, that's the lady that came up with this system of don't learn how words work anymore. Just learn this word means this, and there's no further logic behind it. We need to firebomb the USA. Europe is also suffering from this. You guys don't get away scot-free from this. YouTube and TikTok also exist in Europe. The decline in literacy and numeracy is also being observed in Europe for the same reasons. It's not as bad as America, but you guys aren't escaping this. If we firebomb America, Europe is next. What we need to do actually is firebomb YouTube and TikTok headquarters. Don't actually, that is a joke. In Minecraft, in Roblox, don't. That is a joke. YouTube and Twitch. I do not condone such things that could result in you running afoul of the law in such a way. Thank you. Don't nuke my channel, please. Let's see if anybody else provided experience. Two is a huge issue. Many people are too preoccupied with their phones to simply sit down and read to their children. The chance of them becoming a strong or even competent reader without an adult reading to them is lowered greatly. Read to your kid every night. You'll be glad you did. Yes. Part of it is that direct instruction of phonics has fallen to the wayside. Somebody else mentions phonics, that like kids are no longer learning the etymological building blocks of words. They're just learning the word itself. Condone is such a weird word. You think it mean condemnation? Well, condone is the opposite of condemn, right? Condone, the suffix is don. And then condemn, the suffix is dem. In fact, it's the same. Condemnation is a translation of condamnation in French. It comes from that word. Damn and condemn are the same root word. You see what I'm doing? I'm using phonics, the shit that kids are not being taught anymore. So to condemn something is to say to damn it. Done is not don't? No, it is not. Don't is a contraction, which means do not. Do is a conjugate of the verb to do. Faire in French. So don't is actually spelled like this. D-O-N apostrophe T, because the N apostrophe T is a contraction of the word not. I'vent. You joke, but yes, there are contractions kind of like that. I haven't, or I've not. Technically, I'vent isn't a like real one, but it's a fun joke to do. That's an interesting fun fact. That's not a fun fact. I learned that in kindergarten. If that's like, oh wow, interesting fun fact, I have bad news for you. I might have to hold your hand as I tell you this. Or maybe not, because the education system failed me in various ways too. I don't think it's that much of a stretch to say the education system has failed you as well, because it's failed everybody. Also, don, the don in condone, I think, comes from like D-O-N, the root word meaning to give or gift, right? Because that's also, I think, pretty similar to the Latin or French root word. And the verb donner in French means to give or to gift. So condone is to like give leeway, like to say, yes, that's okay. And to condemn is to take leeway, to forbid something, to say, damn you for doing that. You know, out of the question, right? Looks like some schools, states are starting to pick it back up again, though. Yeah. Some states are fighting this, thankfully. New York is aiming to bring phonics back up. That's good. Short version, if you don't want to listen to the whole thing, is that Lucy Calkins wanted to make money teaching people to read, so she repackaged whole language reading instruction, i.e. just read a lot and you'll know how to read. That's not how this makes sense. Or that's not how that works. Reading a lot does help your ability to read, but you have to have a foundation and intellectual curiosity and drive to learn what things you don't know mean in order to make that work. And something that can be done wholesale in schools, which means without doing anything else. And which could entirely, well, okay, there we go. And they specify, and which could entirely replace phonics instruction. She was very effective at selling this idea. So from about 15 to 20 years ago until maybe about 2 or 3 years ago, schools deprioritized good reading instruction in favor of popular reading instruction so they could look like they were being competitive. Lucy Calkins made a bunch of money and a generation never learned how to read. There's a special place in hell for Lucy Calkins. Being competitive. I wonder what economic system could motivate schools as social institutions to need to play to competition as a concept in an economy of scale. I wonder what system could be based around economic competition that could have schools doing the trendy thing instead of the thing that nets the best educational outcomes in order to secure funding as part of a competition. I'm struggling. It's right on the tip of my tongue. I can't place this, this economic system that's centered around competition. You get me. I do want to point out too, the only reason that reading will help you learn how to read is if you have a foundation of phonics instruction and an intellectual hunger for knowledge, right? You'll only you wouldn't be able to learn through reading if you couldn't already identify a thing that you don't know, right? You have to have some level of literacy to go in, read something, be like, there's a thing I don't know. Let me look that up. What does that mean? Right? This is a really great example of the actual problem. Oh, let me read this first. I was in an affluent, high expectations, high achieving district that bought into Lucy hook, line, and sinker. This district went all in. No piloting the program, no teacher feedback. Massive red flag. That mindset makes people more leftist. Yes, it is critical to point out intellectual curiosity, the willingness and desire to learn makes people more left-leaning, radicalizes people to the left. I cannot stress enough how much of not an accident it is that the education system has deteriorated in such a way to reduce the prominence of literacy rates and critical thinking skills and the desire to actually learn and engage with material. This is not by accident. No piloting the program, no teacher feedback. The superintendent, who had 5 years experience as a high school math teacher before becoming a superintendent of a K-8 district, spent tens of thousands of dollars sending people to the teachers' college, buying curriculum, forcing it on everyone. It was a shit show. I've heard that the students are now struggling and teacher turnover is a big problem. This is a hallmark of a struggling school. Teacher turnover and obviously the kids struggling to make good grades, but yeah. This is a really great example of the actual problem. There is no magic bullet. There's no single program that appropriately teaches any skill set, especially one as complicated as reading. We have stratified our educational structures. There are 3 major byproducts of that. There's a moat of both time and space between district leadership and classroom experience. So leadership is unaware of the nuance of teaching in the modern environment and do not have a boots on the ground understanding of what they're expecting teachers to do. This is literally I cannot make up how much this is an argument in favor of socialism and schools should be run by the teachers and fucking cut out the consultant private sector administrative bullshit. This is I couldn't write a better argument if I sat down with the explicit purpose of doing so. But this is just dollars that could and should be paid to train teachers directly, develop and broaden their expertise, are being spent on big box programs and additional district administrators who do not care about student growth, but that the line that they're in charge of goes up. Again, I try not to be radicalized into socialism challenge, difficulty impossible. Assuming, of course, you know how to read and have reading comprehension. Teachers become infantile, and they add, Teachers become infantilized because they don't have direct access to training materials, aren't in a position to use their expertise without sometimes pedantic oversight from someone who has a moat of time and space between them and the classroom, and who does not know the nuance of teachers under their own regime. So the new guy thinks he's buying a magic bullet for the district, and that he needs to ensure 100% compliance with this program to ensure that he gets value out of the program, and that the numbers on the board, that the numbers the board want to see all go up. He blames the numbers going down on noncompliance, and he views pushback as laziness. They just don't want to learn this new awesome thing to help their kids. The culture dies, the teachers with strong expertise leave, and the board hires a new guy behind a different moat to fix it. Yeah, no wonder there's teacher turnover. Nobody fucking considers in the school districts what the teachers actually have to say in matters of teaching children. I don't know whether it's the same in Europe, but the decisions made for the direction of pedagogy at public schools in America are at no point made by the teachers. You saw in me reading this, sometimes teachers don't even get to provide comment or feedback on things that they are now forced to do. It is run by administrators and politicians. School board members are elected. They are politicians. They campaign for office, which means they are going to be in that fucking competition brain too. These administrators, like this person says, the administrators, the school boards, they're worried about the cameras, the PR, the numbers, line going up. They want to look good for the photo op. And a lot of times that runs directly contrary to educational outcomes for kids, because that shit is not easy to write down as a line going up. Test scores are. How much you want to bet they're doing this because of the blue wave that happened in the past? Buddy, it extends way beyond that. It extends so far beyond that. This, I don't know, you might remember that I've talked about public education as a concept on the stream before. The fight against education started at the same time as public education itself. In, I think, 1834, there was a little law signed in, there was a bill signed into law called the Education Act, or the Public Education Act, or something like that, which established that a department must be set up and funding allocated for public schools, schools that children can attend free of out-of-pocket cost. It would be funded by their communities and by the state. And for that, for that taxation, for that funding, kids could attend school, learn to read and write, and do mathematics for free. Conservatives in America were unilaterally opposed to this because, and they said this outright, it would enable low income, it would enable very poor, destitute, and black kids to learn to read and write. They wanted to keep education in the purview of the church and out of the purview of the public sector, because that way they could gatekeep whoever they wanted out of education. It was a much easier way to maintain a ruling and subservient class. It was literally at the time illegal in many states for slaves to learn how to read. Ever since then, it has always been like this. Conservatives have always hated public education. The business magnates, the people who want to be dominant and lord over something or someone, have always been at their core anti-education, no matter how much lip service they pay to it, no matter how much they recognize its importance, no matter how much they may think they support it. They will always be incentivized to act against public education. And education as a concept, critical thinking and reading, literacy, numeracy as a concept. This phenomenon, the they're doing this because extends all the way back to the invention of the modern public school system almost 200 years ago. It is way the fuck longer of a contradiction, way the fuck more historic of a contradiction than just the blue wave. Either the blue wave that happened this year, the blue wave that happened in 2018, the blue wave that happened in 2006. They have always hated education. The difference now is that we are seeing some of the most drastic consequences of them winning. Instead of getting rid of the school system, they realized they could merely infiltrate it, gradually siphon resources from it, whether it be in the form of administrators and contractors and people in the private sector, taking resources away from what would otherwise be the education of students and the ability of teachers to provide education for those students, or whether it be private schools, charter schools, who have successfully lobbied for less money to go to public schools at all, and for more money to be put into school voucher programs, whereby a private school can receive public money that would otherwise go to public schools. They infiltrated it, and that made them more successful in destroying education than any attack from outside could have ever dreamed of. Inshallah, we must dethrone capitalist system. Inshallah. Inshallah, habibti. Or just arrogance. The last 3 years before I retired, high school English language teacher, or English language. I don't know what ELA means. I'm kind of assuming. High school. We got an assistant principal who was an English guru. He had taught all AP classes for 3 years before becoming a principal. Just fuck that. You've never even taught regular kids. You should become internalized. Not to mention when teachers are given a curriculum that has line for line what a teacher should say to her class for the whole lesson. There are some curriculums like this. I remember some of the early signs of this rot were present in my high school experience. In high school, when I was, I think, you know what, that's, oh God. Yeah, I think we've seen enough. I want to go over one last thing. When I was in high school, I developed my political views. I was radicalized more or less. So I've been a socialist ever since I was in high school. I was a pretty stupid socialist, but a socialist nonetheless, who understood that capitalism as a system does a lot of things that can't be sustained long term and creates a lot of suffering, right? Literally, I was exposed to this by reading the Communist Manifesto. I was like, wait, this guy's kind of cooking. And I read some more stuff. You know, so it goes. In one of my history classes, there was, I think, some kind of controversy with one of my history teachers. Really cool guy. And I was sad to see him go because he was a really great history teacher. He inspired me to really like that history class. And people enjoyed his class. People enjoyed learning history because of it. He was replaced by another teacher. And she was still, I would gauge a pretty competent teacher in her own right, but nowhere near as charismatic or inspiring of the kind of hunger for knowledge that the previous teacher was, right? And this was an American history course, and it covered the full scope of American history. It was Virginia, U.S. history, because I went to school in Virginia. It covered the full scope of Virginia, U.S. history from the colonial days up to the modern day, which means that you start actually running into this problem with history classes where you're actually supposed to not express a political preference in teaching history, which gets very difficult when you get to the 20th century. We were learning things up to the 1970s and 1980s as part of our history class, because I was in high school in the 2010s. 30 plus years ago, that's stuff that you could write about in a history book and teach in a history class. History starts to overlap with politics. We get to the Cold War, the Vietnam War, and the teacher says, okay, we're going to learn what socialism and communism are. And they say, Communism is when the government owns stuff. And when the government owns everything, that's socialism. And you don't get to own anything. And socialism is the more extreme version of communism. I am paraphrasing, but these are the exact points that she made. I actually had to ask her, like, can I talk to you outside? And ask her, like, yeah, could you not say that that's what socialism and communism is? Because that's not what they are. And she was like, what? Why? I said, I'm a socialist. Socialism and communism are not just when the government owns everything. And if we're doing the which one is a more extreme version or whatever, first it's socialism, then you move into communism over time, right? You have to have a master's degree in teaching to become a certified teacher. And I was just a teenager who had recently read the Communist Manifesto, which is not a long or particularly difficult read. I have no doubt that the curriculum had that written down, that that was part of the curriculum. Again, this is not to gas me up as all that in a bag of chips. I'm not, and I wasn't. But Jesus Christ, this is me being able to personally attest to the curriculums telling teachers to say some shit, you know, to the kids. But definitely not to like teach them certain things. I don't remember a whole lot of what I learned after that teacher left. I still do remember a good amount of what I learned when that teacher was there. Shout outs to this guy. In Virginia U.S. history, he had a way of getting us to remember historical events that would otherwise sound really boring. For example, in a lot of American history textbooks, there are a lot of religious movements and micromovements that will be referred to as the something Great Awakening, right? The Great Awakening. Basically, it's like, these various phases and points in history where you can identify American Protestantism and different kinds of American Protestantism becoming more fleshed out and distinct from other forms of Christianity, both in the New World, because, a lot of Catholics lived in the Spanish colonies and former colonies and whatnot, and Protestantism and Christianity in Europe, And you know what? He said, I guarantee this was like part of what got him in trouble. He called it the Great Wake Yo Ass Uppening. And everybody fucking flipped a shit laughing the first time he said that. And there were like 2 or 3 of these phenomena that were referred to as the Great Awakening. You have the first, second, and third Great Awakenings, right? These religious movements. And he referred to them as the first, second, and third Great Wake Yo Ass Uppenings. And I remembered that. And I remembered partially what these religious movements were. I remembered one of them involved the temperance movement. And I remembered that because I loved learning and this guy loved teaching. Who knew that teaching people would be easier if you have a personality? Yeah. It was great. It was awesome. And it became a running joke that each time, because like religious movements in America became more and more insular, it became a running joke that each time he mentioned the Great Wake Yo Ass Uppening, it'd be a bigger number. We got to like the 10th or 11th Great Wake Yo Ass Uppening, which is a smart joke. It's a historically literate joke. And legitimately, it's in like, I would say it's actually like inspired, absolute cinema type shit, right? Because it also communicates that, yeah, American Protestantism is very, in a way, it's very fractured and individualist. You have a lot of these movements spawning micro movements, ever smaller micro movements that shape the religious and ideological landscape of America. And that was all, I guarantee 100% him going off script. I love learning. This is why I care about this so much. I care about this a lot. Um, Funnily enough, that experience in high school and that baseline education of why of like the introduction to how weird American Christianity is actually made me really interested to watch creators like Knowing Better. I watched Knowing Better, and I actually recognized some of these things from my high school history class because I learned about them from the first or second Great Wake Yo Ass Uppening. Um, you know, I think we even learned about the Seventh Day Adventist by name, which was pretty goofy for like high school. I love learning. I have a video about this on my channel where I fucking crash out at an AI written study and explain why that's bad, but also explain how I remember so much stuff that I learned because I love learning. And I write shit, I read shit, I look up shit that I don't understand when I come across it because I want to understand. You know, I like to think that I have pretty good critical thinking skills. Yeah, it wouldn't take that much effort to make these entertaining skits, like, you know, to make entertainment out of educational shit, right? But a key component of that, I would not have learned anything if I couldn't read, if I couldn't write. And the fact of the matter is, there is a literacy crisis in America right now. This is a subreddit for teachers. And as sad as like the internet is in such a sad state, I'm inclined to believe that Reddit at this point is a more credible source of information than not, especially because news outlets being owned by the same contractor interests and like subject to the same political pressures as a lot of the school boards that are making these horridly alienating decisions that harm teachers and students alike, they have incentives to never talk about this. You know, social media and the internet in its hyper capitalist form, where everything is about advertising, everything is about the maximal spread possible of lights and colors, catering to the shortest possible attention span because they are seeking to colonize your brain and capture more and more of your attention as market share. Yeah, it is like this is designed to destroy the education system. And it has now infiltrated the education system through corporate partnerships, through contracts, through these administrators that are molded by political pressures and delusions of grandeur and an ego that is deeply intertwined with like these corporate big shot kind of identities that kind of reject intelligence and education as a concept implicitly. Yeah. The conservatives have been waging a war on public education since the invention of public education. They would not, I don't think they would have succeeded were it not for social media and the kind of telecommunications capture that a privatized internet has afforded them. We gotta read. You gotta read. You gotta read. Take notes. I I remember really not liking classes that assigned a lot of homework. And I will maintain that there was a good reason for that because a lot of the homework wasn't particularly good at helping me learn. I don't think. Most of the things I remember about school are in-class experiences that were so interesting that they stuck with me for a long time. But I'm about to sound like one of those teachers, though I might not want to. Do your damn homework. Read a book. Learn something. Not by watching a YouTube video, not by going on social media. I think we can all recognize that the internet is composed of a lot of brain rot. Even very internet-addled people will recognize this. Read a book. Find a good book to read. Find a difficult book to read. This is like, I don't mean to judge anybody here. I want you to find a book that is difficult, and I want you to read it because it is difficult, and I want you to slog through it even if it takes a long time because you'll learn something. And you'll develop your critical thinking skills. It's funny though that you say that, Han Fixar, when the more people learn, the more likely they are to be leftists. You know, it's not an accident that being on the left and being well educated are very, very closely correlated. And it's because the right wing are retards. And they want to hoist their retardation on the children who will compose the future of this country and every country on earth, so that they will be good, submissive little slaves for capital. Or for whatever hierarchical structure they encounter. Seriously, I am serious about this though. Read a book. Find a difficult book to read. Find a book that has a lot of big words. 25-cent words, as my dad used to call them. Or $5 words, whichever it is, right? And learn what those words mean. Learn some shit. It's fun, I promise. Nonetheless, sounds like a lot of Googling words? Yes, and it will be. How do you think I learned French? I read the French news article, like the French news journal, every day with the explicit intention to find things that I don't understand, to look them up and learn them because I want to learn. I love learning. What I'm telling you to do is read something that's going to require you to Google a lot of words. Han Fixar, that goes for you too. Find a good book with a lot of 25-cent words or $5 words and read it. Write down what the words mean. I can't fix this. Most of us probably, even combined, can't fix this. But the fact of the matter is we have to recognize that it's happening. America is suffering a literacy crisis that is resulting in a what I think is an ultimate or at least penultimate deterioration of the public education system, particularly, resulting in a generation of kids that are subliterate or even wholly illiterate in many cases, where it is seldom found that kids are like reading on grade level. It's increasingly uncommon that kids read on grade level anymore. We have to bring back education as like a thing. But apart from that though, I don't really know how to end the segment. This started with the right-wing infiltration of education. You weren't here for this, Han Fixar, because I know you're barely cognizant excuse for a human being, but the worst excesses of like the modern education system resulting in kids being as stupid as they are came from the Bush administration. NCLB, No Child Left Behind. I used to think that this was a bit. When I was in college, this became discourse, right? I used to think that it was a bit that, oh, you're not allowed to flunk children out of school anymore, right? You're not allowed to give them a failing grade. In a lot of cases, that's actually true now. You're not allowed to give kids a failing grade. We need to bring that back too, because you can't move on until you've learned. What NCLB prioritized was just moving kids on regardless to produce a workforce more quickly. I used to think it was a bit, but it's unfortunately not. Like I mentioned at the very beginning of this segment, I was introduced to this issue with like a very late 2000s to early 2010s impression and understanding of what the internet was, where it had already advanced to a much more consolidated, much more privatized, much more paywalled, much more brain rotted and advertisement centric state, And that has had extremely dire consequences, extremely quickly too. I don't know. Read a book. Keep exercising your brain. Your brain is a muscle. If you don't exercise it, it'll atrophy just like any other muscle in your body. And we gotta fucking cut out the private sector and all these contractors and administrators that are eating up this money that should be going to teachers. Jesus Christ. But I'm obviously only one person. You know, I can't do anything about any of that. But I can tell you to read a book and to learn some shit. Us idiotic rightoids feel charter schools and free market would be a far greater use and efficiency of resources. Yeah, that's exactly part of the infiltration of the public education system that I described. Charter schools and private schools exist in juxtaposition to public schools to serve as an economic measure of segregation, to filter the wealthy kids into a different education system so that they can more easily attain positions of power, whereas public schools kind of languish. And to complement this, charter schools were invented, whereby private schools could benefit from public money. You understand, if charter schools were not part of the picture, it was just private and public schools, right? Then the private schools would be entirely privately funded, and the public schools would be entirely publicly funded. But as it is, all of the money that is meant to go towards education, public money, doesn't go to public education. Some of it goes to charter schools, and that's by design. It's no coincidence that conservatives consistently advocate for the shrinking of public schools' budgets, or at least not to expand them, and advocate for more outsourcing of things to the private sector. It is explicitly to deprive resources from public education. That's the entire reason that charter schools exist. And teachers' unions are unfortunately pretty toothless to stop any of this. Most of this phenomenon has been met with mounting horror from teachers, that they are basically powerless to stop this in the face of administrators, school board members, and contractors who have way deeper pockets and connections and can simply bulldog over them without even giving them the opportunity to so much as give feedback. So once again, barely cognizant human being shit, but worth addressing because like it's such a good encapsulation of the issue that everything that conservatives can even pretend to positively aspire towards destroys the social contract. You know? That's it. Cut the segment. Unfortunate note to end on, especially after what I spent the rest of the stream talking about. I mean, if you had a brain, you'd be able to engage with what I'm saying, but you know, child left behind, I suppose. I'm gonna find somebody to raid. I think I'm about done with stream for today. I've gone for about 3 hours. If I smash my head into a wall until retardation, I would converse with you. I encourage you to please do so. That'd be a more productive use of your time than being in my Twitch chat, expressing your retardation to the world. And I think it would serve more social utility for you to bash your own head in. Thank you. Aoife is live. Let's go raid Aoife. One of my favoriteest trans women on the internet. Aside from myself, obviously. Yeah. Hope y'all enjoyed. I'll see you next time. Again, sorry it ended on kind of a downer. The rest of the stream was pretty fun though before that.